I'm just beyond honored to close out our place-based track with three of the most innovative foundations in the country that are doing place-based investing that have sort of global applicability. We've had a lot of conversations about this sort of volatile and dire moment that we're in today. And we would be remiss not to sort of start there and to think about our communities that are feeling this pain in real ways. In fact, we were just standing in the corner talking about communities that are feeling this right now. And I think we all know that place-based capital can meet the needs with urgency and with demand, with context, with purpose, and I would say with context that, non-place-based capital doesn't. And so I'm just incredibly impressed and honored to be sitting next to these three. I think I maybe forgot to introduce myself. I'm Lindsay Zizumbo. I'm with the Sorenson Impact Foundation. And we've been leading SOCAP now for several years. And with that, I'm going to kick it over to our panelists to introduce themselves. So tell us who you are, which foundation you're with, and maybe just a little bit of context about your work before we sort of dive into the deep technical pieces of what you do. I want to say this, we're going to try and not use technical terms. Impact investors always get in their own way and throw around terms that nobody understands. We alienate the space. And so if we use a term up here that you don't understand, just lightly raise your hand and we'll not call on you. We'll just make sure that we deeply define that. I did a community lending panel yesterday, and my colleague was sitting next to someone who said, at least 4 or 5 people next to me pulled out the phone to Google what a CDFI was. And so I want to make sure that we're not in an echo chamber and that we're getting into the roots of the work that we do and everyone can understand the terms that we're talking about. So with that, Richard, I'm going to kick it over to you.
All right. Thank you, Lindsay. And good morning, everyone. To you diehards who are here on the last day of SOCAP, or the newcomers who decided to drop in for this panel, welcome. We're glad you're here. I'm really excited to be in this conversation, in part because I know these folks fairly well. We work together in this impact investing work, and we're learning a lot as we go. But I am Richard Tate, President and Chief Executive Officer at the California Wellness Foundation. We are a $1 billion private foundation. We have about a grant-making program where we put out about $50 million into the community every year across the state of California. And we have committed 100% of our endowment to mission alignment. So what that means is that all of our endowment investments are calibrated for their impact on communities and in relationship to our grant-making priorities. And we have committed to doing that work ongoing as part of the way that we manage our resources. As a foundation, our work is at the intersection of health and racial justice. So we're very clear that access to quality health care, that the ability to live healthy and well in California is deeply rooted in issues around equity and access, including the connection between wealth and health. It's one of the reasons that we reframed our entire strategy to include our endowment investments. That is not a separate part of how we think about our mission. All of our capital is moving to address community needs. The way that we do that is we have a team of people in-house who help us do that work. We have an outside investment advisor, but I have a team of 3 in-house to help us do that critical work of connecting our mission to our endowment investment strategies. I am not the chief investment officer, so the technical questions will go to Lindsay, but I have a chief financial and investment officer, I have a director of investments, and I have an investments associate. Throughout the course of the conversation, I'm happy to be real with you all about what it takes to do this work, and I wanted to start by just letting you know how we structure the work in our organization. We do have a PRI program, program-related investment program, but frankly, that's relatively small compared to this 100% commitment to mission alignment. Of $1 billion, we have about $50 million that we've committed to program-related investments. And that's probably the place when we start talking about physical spaces, places where we're investing, the PRIs and the grant making, those intersect really in localized ways. But investing is a global game. And we think about how our global impact really does direct the work that we do here in California as well. So I'm happy to talk about that. But that's a little bit of who I am and how we come into this work.
Thank you, Richard.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Brenda Solorzano. I'm the CEO and president of the California Endowment. And I kind of say everything that Richard said is what we do, but on a bigger scale. So I have been in this role for the last year and inherited a number of key decisions that the California Endowment has made, similar to what California Wellness has done. So our board made a commitment to also push all $4 billion of our capital into mission-aligned investments. We have historically been in the space of supporting both program-related investments as well as mission-related investments. In fact, the endowment has been doing this since the late 90s. So the decision to transition from doing PRIs and MRIs into what we call all-in was made a couple of years ago. And the idea is, how do we take our entire portfolio and shift it? It's much harder to do than to say, and we can get into some of the details. California Endowment, as I said, is a $4 billion foundation. We're a health conversion foundation, so we also focus at the intersection of health and racial justice. We have a long history of focusing our work at the local level. From 2009 to 2019, the endowment ran project that we called Building Healthy Communities, which is picking 14 communities in the state and investing deeply in those 14 communities. At the end of that time period, we learned a lot from that experiment. One of the things that we learned that has now become a key function of what we do at California Endowment is that the idea of investing locally is important, but even more so, it's important to understand how we build power in community to be able to affect the systems change and create opportunities for people who have historically not been at the power table to be at the power table. So in 2019, we shifted from these 14 communities to really think about how do we use our capital to build power in communities to affect change across a number of different systems that include health system, educational system, the criminal justice system, as well as the economic system that sits in these communities. We have also started to think about how do we move away from what I describe as siloed approaches to investing, because we too have an investment team that has historically worked on MRIs, PRIs, and traditional investments that very rarely had conversations with our program team that was making community investments in program. And what we're trying to do is break those silos and create a cross-functional enterprise approach to how do we deploy not grants, but all of our resources across the work. And that also is hard, and happy to get into a little bit of that. I also am new to this work, not only because I've been in my role just about a year, but also because I've been in philanthropy a long time, but haven't really been at a foundation that has made this commitment to being all in. And so I have lots of ideas to share about things I've learned coming in, things that I would do different had I been at TCE when these decisions were made, and things that we're thinking about moving forward.
Awesome. Hey y'all, I'm Toya Fick. I'm President CEO of Meyer Memorial Trust. We're based in Portland, Oregon, so I came down this morning and I'm very happy to see the sun. Glad that you all came in from the sun to listen to us this morning. Before coming into this role, which I've been in now for a little over 3 years, I was on the board of trustees for the foundation I now work for. So in shorthand, my colleagues became my bosses overnight. And it's been an amazing journey these last few years. It's actually been helpful to get the work to where it is today, which my colleagues alluded to. I think people might be least familiar with Meyer Trust, so I'll give a brief background about who we are, where we are, what we do. So the Meyer Trust, based in Portland, we are a statewide funder. We were founded by the man who started the stores, the Fred Meyer stores. So if you've ever been to a Fred Meyer store, that man, his name was also Fred Meyer. When he died in the late 70s, he didn't have a ton of family left. So he left every dollar that he had invested in the store to start the foundation. It's a great origin story in that it came from a person who left a will and thoughts about what to do, but it was also great because we also don't have family on the board, so it's a family foundation, but not really. So we have a ton of latitude. When we started in 1982, we had 120 million in the endowment. And to date, we've given away about $1 billion throughout Oregon, and we still have $1 billion left, which I think is a really cool magic trick. It's actually phenomenal. It's the best magic trick I've ever seen. So Mr. Meyer was all about place. He was very clear about loving the place that he was able to build a fortune in. He came from Germany, started in New York, went to Alaska, came down and settled in Portland, Oregon, not far from where we are based today, actually. He left us a ton of latitude. We used to follow the footprint of the stores, and now we're just in Oregon, and that only changed maybe about 15 years ago. But he said in his will, you know, I don't know what's going to happen after I die, obviously, and so I'm letting these trustees, these 5 folks who he initially handpicked, who then picked other people as they passed on or left the board. So he said that I'm literally leaving you this money to meet the challenging conditions and problems of the times that you find yourself in. And so we have a ton of latitude to do that. We've been doing a lot of mission-aligned investing over the last few years. In shorthand, we call it letting the 5% make sure that it informs the 95%. We spend more than 5%, but that's sort of shorthand for how we talk about it. Spent a lot of time these last few years, particularly in the last 3, trying to understand what that looks like internally and how to measure that, which is, we're still fairly new in figuring out what that looks like, but I've been begging and borrowing and stealing from my colleagues who are a little bit ahead of us in some ways, and to figure out what that looks like for Meyer, which we'll get into in a bit, but I thought it was important to give the context for where we sit in Portland, Oregon. Nice to see y'all.
I promised myself I wouldn't use the word double click anymore, but here I am. We're going to double click on something. I just want to acknowledge that these folks are all moving beyond the 5%. I mean, no, you hear it a lot, and we talk about it a lot, but to actually see that commitment, to actually see it in action, $1 billion commitment, a $4 billion commitment, is actually pretty unprecedented. There's been you can sort of count on one hand, and it's work as field builders and an impact that we scratch our heads all the time going, why aren't we all putting the endowments to work? Why are we not working on the 95%? And so that commitment to you all, hats off, is amazing. It also makes me a little tired for you and the mandate that you have to execute. And I would love to just dive in to what this means for you as leaders of these incredible organizations. What does it mean for your team? Let's sort of get down to actual structures. Richard, you touched on a little bit of your outsourced versus who your team is, but how does your mission-aligned investing support your place-based initiatives? And what does that actually mean from an execution standpoint? What are the structures? What are the teams? What's yielded the best results? And then I guess I would love to know where the tensions exist internally. Where have you had the hardest uptake, or what are the biggest challenges that you see within your work right now?
Well, first, Lindsay, I just want to acknowledge that one of the reasons that we're on this panel together is because we are not only colleagues and peers as CEOs of foundations who are in this mission-related investing work, but we're actually part of a collaborative of foundations who have committed to doing this mission-based investing work. And that's important because collaboration isn't just a strategy. I think it's actually a responsibility. When you're doing mission-focused work, one institution is not going to change the world. And so if what you really are trying to do is change systems and realities for people on the ground, it needs to be more than one institution paying more than the 5% in grants every year. And so that's part of what's behind this commitment. It's part of what drives my own thinking and my passion for this work, is that there is a responsibility that we have that's shared across institutions. So the U.S. Impact Investing Alliance is part of an organization that we're part of. And that's how we're coming into this work, with a bias toward collaboration, which quite frankly is not always the position that folks take in finance the global capital markets. There's a competitive nature to how you get into investments, what kinds of returns you're making. That is not what drives us. We do have an obligation to be stewarding the resources of the foundation to make a financial return in order to sustain the work that we're doing in community. But all of the money that we steward is for the people, is for the communities. So we are stewarding it on their behalf, and it just makes the decision making very different. So to your question internally, Lindsay, we have had to, number one, before we get to structures, it has been a huge mindset shift for us internally. We have to change our thinking. As a traditional grant-making institution, it was all about the relatively small dollars that were going out as gifts to community. To make a commitment that we're going to use our entire $1 billion to drive our mission meant that we had to shift our way of thinking about impact. That impact could be 5, 10, 15, 20-year investments in the capital markets, could be different kinds of capital that we might leverage. And in order to do that structurally, as Brenda alluded to, we had to look at and break down the silos between who does what in the organization. So at Cal Wellness, we've just recently gone through a review of strategy, and one of the outcomes of that process was to really commit to integrating all of our strategies to think about the levers of change that are available to us. Yes, grant dollars, but also program-related investments, and also market rate endowment investments, and also what we're willing to say and do and share about how we work. And I would add another, which I just alluded to, is our willingness to collaborate across institutions in order to do that work. So we've had to reset our mindset, and we've had to invest. This takes time. It was insufficient to simply ask our outside investment advisor to help us align our endowment to our mission. That whole structure, their whole system, the incentives that drive their work are very different than what I just described to you. And so it has taken a team of people in-house to say, yes, we're going to partner with our outside investment advisors, but we're going to do some additional due diligence, and we're going to collaborate with them to recalibrate their own mindset about what meaningful impact is to what it is that we believe is going to be meaningful and impactful. It's led to lots of conversation around, are we getting the kind of returns that we need? What's good enough? Toya mentioned, being a $1 billion foundation. We've been a $1 billion foundation as well for 20 years. The game that we're in is not about growing the endowment. It's about sustaining the work and making sure that we're having meaningful impact in communities. So that's just a little bit of kind of how we've structured. I mentioned, I've got 3 staff that are doing this work. We've had to shift our mindset. We've had to work with our board of directors. I have a board member who's here with me, Catherine Katcher, in the audience. Hi, Catherine. It's been collaborative work across board, staff, and for me as CEO, really continuing to remind myself that impact is not just grant dollars. It's what we're doing with the endowment as well. And it's forced some tough choices. The localized work, which perhaps we'll talk about, really again is, there's some interesting examples of how we've used PRIs and grant dollars to do that work. We're looking as we make market rate endowment investments for projects that touch infrastructure and things like that are here in California. But there's a world of opportunity, and I think in many ways we're pushing the envelope of what's possible when you think about aligning all of these resources together.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, we're going to double click on that again because
more double clicking.
Most people, but now we're turning it into a game. How many times can we say it? So you now have a challenge. I mean, most program teams, just like to be very frank, don't even talk to each other. And I'm sure Brenda at the size you're at can talk about that a little bit. But when our grants team goes to talk to our market rate team, they're like, what? Who are you? Like, I have no idea what you're talking about. So I love this. I love the different pools of capital and that you're breaking down those silos within your team. I think that's key to success. All right, Brenda, tell us about your structure.
Well, this conversation, I feel like we need 10 days to really talk about everything that I've learned and what we've done and what we would do differently. And I can go in so many different directions. Let me start first with what does it mean for me as the leader of TCE to be leading this work at this particular moment that we find ourselves in. I think the first thing I'll share is these are unprecedented times, and we're leading and making decisions without a roadmap. And we are breaking ground. As Richard said, we're part of a collaborative of, I don't know how many people are in the collaborative.
Claire, is it 20?
20 foundations. So we're cutting edge in a once-in-a-lifetime moment, and we're having to figure both the internal and external elements of our work. So that's mind-boggling and challenging, and I'm being honest, I don't have the answers for everything that is coming across my transium in this work. We have an internal investment team that historically has managed our portfolio, and it has been a team of about 10 people. And then we have had a team of 3 that have done more of our PRI work. Those teams have historically been separate. And then we have a team that is about 60 people that are in our grant-making program team. So those were 3 different teams that were allocating resources in a siloed approach. And by siloed, I mean no cohesive strategy, very little conversation among the different departments. And oftentimes, right hand didn't know what the left hand was doing, and so we were investing in ways that were contradictory. The other thing that I'll share is that the endowment has been around for almost 30 years. And in that 30-year history, we have built an entire portfolio. That portfolio is a complex portfolio that has much of our investment locked. So even though we made a decision to go all in, it's going to take years to undo those traditional investments and turn them into the all-in aligned portfolio that we imagine. So as I've come into the organization, I realized that these silos existed and that if we were really going to move to all-in, we needed to break down those silos. So this year, we've actually moved all of our PRI team into our traditional investment team, and they are now working in collaboration. The other thing we've done is really started to work on aligning around a strategy and figuring out how do we have shared strategic goals that both our program team and now our combined investment team can work towards. And we've identified some specific categories where we think our community-based investments can be focused on, and they are on investments related to strategies that advance health and well-being for people in California, investments in diversifying the pool of managers that we work with, funds that are addressing the economic, or not, the environment and addressing climate change, investments that are really locally based in the communities that we work across California, and then funds that really are around building inclusive community that really thinks about building the capital and the resources that communities and organizations need to advance the kind of change. So now we have a shared strategy. What we're working on next is figuring out what does success look like for this work. It's not traditional ROI because the approach is different. So we've had to have very clear conversations with our board of, you're not going to get what we've been getting in a traditional investment portfolio. But we still think that we can get somewhere between 8 and 9%. In addition to social change that we are saying this is really more important for us at the end of the day, that it isn't just about maintaining the $4 billion that we've had. We also recently decided at the California Endowment to increase our grant-making spend because of what's happening in this moment. So we've doubled from the base 5% that were required by the IRS to 10% over the next 3 years, knowing that we have to do something to meet the moment that our grantees are saying we need resources now. We can't wait for you to undo your capital investments. So that's actually created a really interesting dilemma, because as we've done the economic analysis of these multiple decisions, we actually are probably going to be shrinking our endowment because of this increased spend. But again, we think that that's okay because it's all about social impact and achieving the systems transformations that we're wanting to achieve. The next step for us is to really build a different structure. So we're going to be entering strategic planning next year. And I'm going to eliminate these departments, so our silo that we've now sort of combined, and we're going to structure ourselves into what I'm describing as Avenger teams. We'll have Avenger teams that will be focused on geographic communities. And on these Avenger teams, we will have program grant-making folks, we will have investment folks, both traditional investment as well as mission-related investments, and we'll have communications folks, technology folks, finance folks, all working to support the investment at the local level. And then the other thing that I'll say is it's really important for us at TCE to be thinking about the power dynamic that exists between communities, grantees, and foundations, and figure out how do we flip that power dynamic so that these Avenger teams aren't coming in and telling people what's wrong with them and what the solutions are. Instead, we're listening to community and hearing from them what is it that they feel are the most pressing, challenging issues, and what resources across the spectrum of the Avenger teams do they need. So that's the evolution of where we're going next.
I'm just incredible. The increasing your grant or profile from the 5 to 10% is really meeting the moment where it is. And I mean, hats off to you. That cannot be an easy discussion with your board as you think about what your return profile looks like. And I think we'll come back to Richard to hear how he's meeting the moment too. All right, Toya.
Awesome, thank you. I'm gonna go sit in the audience and just listen to y'all talk. This is amazing. So yeah, a double click, ditto. A lot of the things that you heard, we're doing as well at Meyer. I'll start with the way we first we changed our mission in 2022, and it ended up being the last thing I did as a trustee. So we moved from working in Oregon, trying to make it more equitable and flourishing for all, to accelerating racial, social, and economic justice for Oregon's lands and peoples. So getting from that, was an incredible sort of amount of work, and then 2 weeks later, they were like, will you go and do that and figure out what that looks like for the foundation? I was like, oh, okay, cool. So really spent the last couple of years trying to figure out how we live into a mission that states racial, social, and economic justice. And not just would be nice to do it, we want to accelerate it, right? So that meant more money going out the door. Fred told us in our will, I call him Uncle Fred, said in his will, we don't have to be in perpetuity. So I don't have to think about whether or not we're going to be $1 billion in 20 years. It would be nice if Oregon still needs a Meyer Trust to be around, but we can also think about what we need to do right now. And so we sort of think about how we meet that mission and meet the moment in Oregon in 3 ways. What is our building doing? So we have a headquarters. What are our people doing? And then what are our dollars doing? So our building is in a historically black neighborhood in Portland that was decimated not even a generation ago. And so we open up our doors to grantees for convening space, but also for free rent. So we have a co-working space that we allow some of our grantees to use on a yearly basis for free, but preference to the communities that were decimated that we now are a part of. And so that's one of the ways that we're sort of living into our mission through our assets, through our building every day. Like my colleagues, I spent a lot of time that first year. I'm so glad to not be in my first year anymore, figuring out our configuration and what our structure needs to look like internally, because all of our people need to be meeting our mission and not just the people who are out there giving away the money, right? And so we do a lot of work in a space that we call Beyond the Check. I'm sure many of you have talked about this at your places as well, where we are really thinking about how we help grantees and organizations move from just the program work they're doing to thinking about the systems change. I don't have enough money to solve any problems in Oregon alone. And so we talk a lot about how we're working with our grantees to think about how they're collecting their data, how they're telling their stories, how they're working with other foundations. We do a lot of work with other foundations to help them figure out where their money should go to, but also how you change the systems at the local and state level so there are more zeros coming into your coffers and not just from the Meyer Trust. We did a lot to hire folks internally who have expertise in advocacy work. As a former ED, I was also a grantee when I was a trustee. And spent a lot of time in the advocacy space, and Meyer was the only place I could go and get actual dollars to go and develop policy. How are we doing that across the organization? Where are we doing this in our education portfolios? We have 3 main portfolios: education, wealth building, and the environment, and those are new since our mission. We've been doing work in that space for a while, but really diving in and thinking about how those three things are impacting Oregonians every single day. And those three things carry across the entire organization. So like my colleagues, I did a lot of work to sort of de-silo our work a ton. We have three verticals, which sound like silos, but they're not. We have three verticals that think about this work all the time. What is our operations team doing, and how are they impacting the communities that we're serving? What's our grant-making team doing, and how is our money being used internally and externally? Those three verticals are run by amazing VPs who the four of us spend a lot of time together. We have to understand each other's work. How is the 5% relating to the 95% and so forth? So we spend a lot of time figuring out across those three pieces of our work, how is education and wealth building in the environment showing up in those spaces. So we very recently, as of like 3 weeks ago, worked with our trustees to adopt a new investment policy statement that carries those three portfolio pieces of work into our endowment. So we're not just thinking about our mission writ large, we're really thinking about how is our place-based grant making informing the endowment as well. And so we've done a lot of work over the last few weeks. I know one of my colleagues is here today thinking about how we're measuring all of that, which we'll get into in a bit. But I wanted to talk for a little bit about some of the resistance or the pitfalls that we've seen, because I mean, I talk fast. We did a lot of work over the last 3 years, but it took a ton of work to educate everybody on where we're trying to go. And that looks differently depending on where you sat in the organization. So sometimes it meant the VP of Impact comes to the board meetings where our VP of Investments and Finance is spending the day with our trustees, because they need to understand that work too and see the connections and the through lines between the work that the money is doing and the work that the grant making and impact team is doing. Sometimes it meant really like strongly suggesting to my former colleagues, now bosses, that they take classes around impact investing and sustainable investing, and there's some good ones out there. We do a lot of work to make sure that our trustees and our staff can hear from other people. What I love to do is find an organization who is 4, 5, 6, 10 years ahead of Meyer and say, can you come to my board meeting and talk to my trustees? Can you come to my office and talk to my staff? So that we can learn how they went from where we are today to where they are today and build the bridges to sort of get there. But it took a ton of internal work and time and, pulling people along to get to this place where we are, thinking about this across the verticals, working together across the verticals. We don't have the Avengers yet, but maybe TBD.
I definitely am going to ask my boss if we can start an Avengers team. This is incredible. And I hope if one idea comes from today that we're all building community Avengers together. Yeah. Okay, we've talked a lot about, your market rate team, talking to your catalytic team, talking to your grant team, which for those of you who are in a foundation or run a foundation or a family office, we know how revolutionary that is. So congratulations. I would love to hear what that means on the ground. Give us an example of an investment. Richard, you talked about, you have some examples where you've used PRIs and grants combined. And what that means for your place-based investing. And we heard from Brenda on how she's meeting the moment, so maybe sprinkle that in there. Has that helped accelerate in a moment of crisis, in a time of need? Has that helped sort of accelerate your ability to service your community?
Yeah, I'll just address the last first. Like the endowment, like many foundations, we've accelerated our spending. So far beyond that 5% for this particular year, we'll be at about 8.5%. But since COVID, we've spent at about 7% and above. So we've been at an elevated rate of spend for quite some time. And, as Brenda alluded to, it puts some pressure on the traditional mindset about market returns on the endowment and what we need to be earning in order to sustain the grant making. And so this is deep work, y'all, for foundations to be thinking about how to balance social impact and financial sustainability. And I mentioned this earlier, how much is enough? How much do we really need to be holding on to? And to Brenda's point, many of us are arguing we don't need to be holding on to it at all. It needs to be moving to communities as communities need it. That doesn't mean that market rate investments, longer term investments don't have a role to play, and that's part of the other side of the experiment. How do we find investments that really do align with our mission to this question around measurement? Each of us is likely working with different frameworks to think about how we evaluate those investments relative to our social impact goals. We have sort of a rating system, a number system, but it's a little bit of art, it's a little bit of science to really assess whether or not any individual investment is meeting our social impact goals. And quite frankly, that's where some of the trade-offs come. We've got an investment that has a really high social impact score, slightly lower return rate. We've got one that's got a higher return rate, but lower impact score. And how do we balance those things? But what we're not doing, the break in the silo, is we're no longer saying, okay, that part of the endowment, don't pay attention to that. That drives the earnings. I know we're invested in private health equity that's kind of it's consolidating hospitals and creating access to deserts. We're not doing that anymore. We're not saying we need that investment to drive the grant making, and we're working at cross purposes. But there's deep work to be done to figure out how to strike that balance and how we're going to measure performance and social impact over time. When it comes to the place-based work, I mean, there's some great work that's happening. I think Brenda's team and my team may have been part of a couple of things together. I'll give you examples too. One, a direct investment that we've done, and one kind of a more collaborative effort, both based in Los Angeles. Little Tokyo is a historic neighborhood in Los Angeles, and we have made a combined program-related investment and grant investment to really support the development and the preservation of that particular neighborhood and that community. So that's a $1.5 million PRI that is going to develop housing and businesses in that neighborhood and community, and then a $500,000 grant to support the advocacy and organizing around how that development will be working in that community over time. And that's a place where, again, the teams in the organization came together and they saw an opportunity to use different capital levers in order to make an impact in a very local community. We've also invested in an interesting project here in the Bay Area called Real People's Fund, where we're testing ways that we bring community into the decision making around access to capital. So the Real People's Fund is an investment where community members are deciding who gets the seed capital to do the project, run the business, to build and grow wealth. So those are a couple of examples where we're doing localized work, whether it's in development or whether it's just access to capital and who decides how capital flows in a particular community. And I think those are two important examples. One that I'm really excited about is one that's been a more collaborative project in LA. LA in January experienced wildfires, two different parts of the city, devastating, and a really traumatic experience for the city, but also an experience in which people immediately mobilized to support and engage in how to begin to rebuild and recover. In LA, there have been a number of foundations who have actually organized to collaborate, not just thinking about what one institution is doing, but I think a couple of dozen organizations talking about how they can streamline capital flowing into those communities using program-related investments, sharing due diligence, a shared RFP process and proposal selection process. That has been operating for much of the year, and we're now seeing capital flow. We had, I think, about 24 proposals and about $100 million in requests for dollars, and we're beginning to fulfill those. But it's a good example of moving beyond a single institution strategy and work to really collaborating, people coming together, putting out a shared call, sharing due diligence to streamline the burden on folks who are seeking capital in order for us to accelerate dollars to community. So those are just a few examples of more kind of place-based work, but also this opportunity, and for me, a call to action for all of us to think about ways that we can collaborate to, again, streamline the way that money moves into communities and to folks who are managing work on the ground. Yeah. Y'all are part of that PRI collaborative. Yes. Okay.
Do you see this collaboration happening in real time? So I just want to notify we are going to open up to Q&A. I want to make sure that you all have the opportunity to engage in this conversation with us. so get thinking about your questions. Before we do that, let's move really quickly to just on the partnership piece and the collaboration piece. You mentioned the U.S. Impact Investing Alliance, which has been just an incredible resource for foundations that are committed and dedicated to impact investing. I would love to hear you talk about that a little bit more, or what other collaborations. I mean, it's just incredible to see the work that you guys have done together. I mean, jointly putting out an RFP is complicated enough, and that's just absolutely amazing. So, Toya, maybe we'll start with you.
Perfect. Because we've been rebuilding a lot of the things that we've done forever over the last few years, I've had the pleasure of calling a lot of my colleagues to see where they are and share information. I think I've read maybe 12, maybe more investment policy statements to get great ideas for what to do and how this should look. And so spent a lot of time in my first year, especially, I think I see Jim in the room, asking people to come and say, can you just talk to my board about what you did and how you got there? And it's been so helpful to then move to the conversation of, okay, well, here's what it looks like for Meyer. So again, like 4 weeks ago, we have a new investment policy statement that really dives into how we're looking at our dollars differently through the lens of the work that we're doing on our grant making side. And so that wouldn't have happened unless, I had access to folks who would be willing to share information with us. And so we have 3 components of our, really moving all of our endowment 100% mission aligned investing over the next 10 years in 3 ways. Looking at diversity of the firms that we're with, the environmental solutions that they're proposing to use our money to do, and then what kind of solutions directly impact the people on the ground. And we're really thinking about how we measure a lot of this and thinking about it, I think, in some innovative ways. So for example, for diversity, we're not just looking at diversity of the firm, but who is getting the carried interest of the fund that we're in. Is that fund diverse? Are those folks diverse, right? Like really thinking about it in that next layer. We've had so many conversations with our managers where they come in and they'll say, oh, we've funded 25 companies from this fund. And I'll ask, well, how many of them are diverse? How many of them are thinking about solutions for people on the ground? Putting that in our IPS and our impact statement was very important to us to make sure that we're measuring towards those type of goals. Yeah, my colleagues have talked about giving more money away, doing more than the 5%. The first vote I took in 2016 was to move Meyer from 5% to 6%. So that was almost a decade ago, and now we are far beyond that. But how do we put that policy into place so that we're thinking about it in a more of a range? So when folks need more money, we can give more money. And first person I called was Richard to say, can I look at your spending policy, my friend, so that I can think about how to sell this to my trustees, right? So that sort of collaboration, it may not always be with funds because we are so place-based and we're one of the few large endowments in Oregon, and we feel like we need to stay there and make sure that we're working hard there. But there are other ways to learn from each other, and so it's important to make sure that you have friends that you can call to figure out how to get where you're going.
I can't wait to hear what you've learned looking at all those investment policy statements. That is, there's
coming out soon. We'll be doing our first report in January. So I'm super excited about that.
I just want to highlight, the 3 of us have talked about one of our endowment investment strategies really focusing on diversity. And I just want to underscore that as a really key measure of, from our perspectives, obviously social impact and what's needed and the way to harness the global capital markets for social change. I mean, this is really about providing access to capital to folks who historically have been helped the least or not at all, who typically have not had access to capital, don't typically look like us. And in this environment, that is, it feels bolder than it even did a year ago. But we've remained committed to doing this work around identifying, partnering with diverse managers in order to change the way that capital flows in the global markets. And that's a really important piece of this work. I don't want to let it get lost. I'll give you one example of something that we've learned. We started with a fairly new fund, Vamos Ventures in Los Angeles. And for a variety of reasons, we decided that our initial investment with them would be a program-related investment, which is basically a way of saying we don't expect you to make market rate returns. We learned pretty quickly that although we got money to Vamos Ventures, it really didn't help them in the broader ecosystem for them to get a program-related investment. And we have moved them now into our endowment portfolio. So they are not an emerging manager or whatever euphemism we use to basically say, we're going to give you a pass, but this is a legitimate investment, and these are folks that we are investing in because they are focused on the communities who historically have not been granted access to capital, or very little, if any. And that's the work that we're doing. So I just didn't want to let that pass because I think anyone who's interested in social capital markets, that is where the work really happens. Yes, issue areas, how can the endowment work on climate issues? Yes, how can the endowment work on health access issues? But that diversifying the capital markets, I think, is a really important part of this work.
Brenda?
So much. There's a couple of points I was typing, because it's old brain, I forget things, so I have to write them down. But I want to go backwards on a couple of different things that I think are important for the audience to understand. One thing that is a tension point that we often don't talk about when we're having these conversations is the different duties that a board of a foundation have to balance. On one hand, they have the fiduciary duty, which is really to protect and grow the assets. On the other hand, they have the duty of care, which is to ensure that the mission is being achieved, which requires spend. And I don't think in philanthropy we often speak about those tensions with board members and really elevate it in a way that requires trustees to really engage in a difficult conversation around, like, what's most important here, folks? And if you decide that mission is really higher priority than return, then how do we think about using our investments differently? So I just wanted to bring that up because this is the second foundation that I've been headed up, that I've been able to double our payout, and it's always been rooted in that conversation. So I wanted to share that little nugget. The second thing, collaboration is really key, and I'm glad that we're hitting on it on this panel, but it's not just collaboration across foundations, it's also how you think about collaboration down the vertical, right? So collaboration with investment partners, with grant partners, with community, and really be, thinking about if we were to bring all those different players together and have a conversation of how do we best deploy resources in a community to achieve the kind of impact you want to do, what might that look like? So I'll share one investment that we've done. We have invested in an organization, Community Vision. It's a CDFI. They have been providing technical assistance and capital to both help community understand ownership and actually build capital in property. This has been important because one of the things we've heard from our power building grantees is that the work is important, but they don't have places across the state where they can come together and work. They don't own their buildings, so they are constantly having to find new spaces, either to lease or to meet in. And so there's been a huge push from our grantee partners to say, how do we acquire property? How do we buy buildings? And so we've been working on grant investments to our power building partners, not only around the power building, but also on building their capacity to understand how do you build capital, and then investing in the CDFI to actually have a resource so that when they're ready, they are able to provide resources for those organizations. That's really an important sort of example of collaboration down the vertical that I think I also want to say is a critical, important part of this. And then the LA fires is really interesting because it's one of the first time that I have seen a lot of different players come together around a community, and particularly the Altadena community has been sort of the focus of the funder commitment. But it has also generated conversations with other investor types that also have mission-related reasons for wanting to give money, and now talking to foundations and having now partnerships with organizations that we wouldn't necessarily have thought about partnering, but they have an interest, we have an interest, and now we can leverage the resources to really impact an equitable rebuild of the Altadena community. Yeah.
Incredible. Okay, we're going to open it up to Q&A. Our amazing SOCAP host here has a mic. Thank you, Richard.
Hello, I'm Devin Murphy from Integrated Purpose, and I focus on issues of wealth inequality. There are a lot of really great, amazing innovations that address wealth inequality that are happening at a local level. So I think about community investment trusts within Portland, some of the baby bonds efforts that are happening across California, the community development work you spoke of. And yet, when I look at the landscape from the perspective of national funders, there's very little infrastructure that allows them to be able to assess that landscape and be able to move resources to local communities. Can you help us sort of think through what might that infrastructure look like in the future that might be able to bring in some of those national funders into some of the places and domains where you're operating?
I don't believe that that place exists. And one of the things that I've learned over time as I've sat at the table with my alliance colleagues, this group of 20 foundations, and they do represent a mix of national and global foundations, and then some folks who are locally focused or geographically focused like us. One of the big ahas for me in that space has been there has not historically been a lot of sharing of data and information. As I alluded to, in the foundation world, it's often been about one foundation. I'm focused on what my institution is doing, my strategy, my assessment of the landscape, my network of partners. And so we've realized in my conversations with alliance colleagues, we have a lot of work to do to get to a point where, frankly, beyond the CEOs who show up for these meetings, our investment teams, our outside investment advisors, our boards are willing to say, we should be collaborating and sharing more. Some of us are having to unwind institutional structures and mental models in order to do that more collaborative work. I don't think it exists, but it's an opportunity for us to begin to share and think about that kind of work before. I think the LA wildfires is an example of suddenly folks saying, hey, rather than each of us doing our landscape analysis and assessment of what's needed and who we might partner with, how do we come together and share information? But here's the thing, it takes different capacity. That effort took, I would say, 40% of my director of investments time to really lead that collaborative effort in the first 6 months of the year, which was not planned work for him. Collaboration doesn't magically happen. People don't just show up in a room and suddenly, to your point, there's a landscape analysis. And I know, just because I sat in a room with Toya, what to be doing in Oregon if I want to make that work happen. Someone has to take the lead. Someone has to say, I'm going to put my dollars and resources to staffing that. And that's part of the work ahead, is to think about what are those models and those collaborative spaces that go deeper than just information sharing and learning, which is a great start. But I definitely see a need for that even among the alliance.
I think you've named ego, Richard. Ego has been huge in philanthropy, and egos of CEOs and egos of boards have really been driving towards not collaboration, quite honestly. How do we have the best report, the best, whatever. And so that, I think, is something that we need to talk about and really challenge and change. Agree that I don't think a space like that exists, but borrowing from our power building grantees, this is an opportunity to organize. And, who wants to step up and say, we need this space, we're going to create this space. And, some of it is on us and some of it is on folks in the audience as well. And I think that foundations have started, maybe it's not foundations, trustees have started to think differently about who they recruit. And there's a huge sea change in terms of who sits in leadership positions at foundations. Like all of us have been in our roles 3 years or less. And this is where representation matters, because folks that are coming into these roles have a very different lens, I think, than who have historically held these roles. And it opens up ways to partner in ways that are different. So, Richard and I are always talking about how do we truly collaborate? Not just talk about it, but how do we truly collaborate? And as we enter a strategic planning process, I've intentionally built into it for next year a real deep engagement with fellow health funders in California and across the country to help inform based on what they're doing, what they think we should, where there are opportunities to partner with the California Endowment. So I think also the kind of leaders that are coming in are maybe a little bit more open than my experience has been in terms of true collaboration. And then the last thing I'll say is I appreciate the question because I actually have a national network, and I'm constantly thinking about how do I connect our national colleagues down to folks on the ground, because there's often not that place. And so I have a responsibility, and others I think have a responsibility to tap into those national networks to make the local connections.
I just want to quickly thank Devin for the work that you're doing with STIRD and the foundation to create just that with regard to wealth building, pulling us together, thinking about how we're learning from each other. Because again, like I don't know a thing, right? Like I will tell you all the time, but I will beg, borrow, and steal from people I think are doing the work that we want to be on the way to doing. And so I appreciate the work that you're doing to pull us all together to learn from each other on this really important topic.
We should give a shout out. There, Confluence Philanthropy, even Mission Investors Exchange, there are some efforts to try to do that, but I would say that they're mostly at this level of kind of learning and ideas exchange, some information exchange, but your point is well taken. There's a next level of organizing and collaboration that could happen.
Thank you for what you are doing. Lindsay, I didn't count the number of those weeks, but I counted the number of times that you mentioned systems, collaboration, working together. Our foundation has spent decades studying systems, and I want to share 3 things with you and then ask you a favor. First one is that leaders tend to underestimate what a system is and tend to think that they can wing it or put people that don't really know what they're doing to develop innovation in structures, organizations, metrics, systems. The second one is that there are so many industries today, like defense, like energy, oil and gas, that are putting so much emphasis and dollars in doing that and developing new systems. So we are creating a society where the people who are creating extractive industries are learning how to do this, and the rest of us are trying to wing it, and that is creating a disparity. This is reflected in universities. I study systems, and all of my classmates are in defense, in aviation, and stuff like that. The last one is an anecdote. As a foundation, we presenting grants and funds for organizations, not like yours, but others. We are based in Texas. By the way, some people in Texas love California, like me. We get deaf ears from foundations on systems because impact is not seen as new metrics. And that's where my favor is. I want to ask you to operationalize, to train your people that are giving grants and putting money on the table to understand that impact is new metrics, is new organizational structures, is new mental models and new frameworks and new philosophies. That's my favor to ask.
Oh, that lands for me because I think, there's always there's another tension, which is how do we move money and dollars immediately to communities to address the needs that are happening now? And I think you've heard some ambition from the 3 of us in our institutions to think about how do we reimagine philanthropy? What can a philanthropic institution be? How do we move from being, grant-making organizations to, social change philanthropies? And that takes time and effort to rethink staffing models, to Brenda's point, collaboration approaches, different internal systems, as well as, I think you alluded to this, how we relate to the current system, and even more ambitious, how do we build new systems? And that is a role that foundation philanthropy can play if we're able to be bold in how we think about and vision for that work. But we're in a moment where I feel it every day, the tension between let's help community and meet the needs where we are right now, and should some portion of us be about this other longer term game of rethinking foundation philanthropy? And so I sit with that question a lot. I appreciate you naming it.
Yeah, I think that it's a great question and a challenge for us, but often we approach these kinds of things as binary. We either have to do this or we have to do that. And I think we need to move away from that. and really think about how do we do both. We have to do both. It's why we're at TCE having this all in that's really about the longer term, but we also increased our spend because it's about this moment. We're thinking about systems change, but also thinking about mutual aid and what is needed at this particular moment. And I think that's really, the future of philanthropy is to reimagine, as Richard said, how do we operate? What do we do? How do we collaborate? How do we do all the things differently? I also think it requires a different skill set. So part of what I'm doing right now is I've created new job descriptions that are different than a grant maker. And I have a team that is full of grant makers. But if I'm going to have folks that are going to be thinking about social impact and being on an Avenger team, I've got to be thinking about different folks. And that's also hard, right? Like to have to come in and tell folks that and make that transition is difficult. And to then, hopefully model it for the rest of the field. That's going to be difficult because I've been on this crusade to change philanthropy and everybody always tells me all the reasons why they can't. It's one of the reasons I took this job at TCE is because I want to be able to show folks that even big, large foundations that have been at it for a while need to evolve.
And I think all that also takes like how we measure our own success. So we collect data, of course, and reports and things like that. But one of the things that we are really thinking about is how are our dollars changing the ecosystem, right? Does the ecosystem have more capacity to do their work, right? Are they able to engage in systems change? Is what we're doing making a difference in that space too, and how we report that to our trustees? And it's not just how many grants do we give, how many people are now reading it at third grade level, but is the ecosystem better because of the way we do our work? And to the point about building capacity differently internally, we have someone on staff who it was so important to me, where 80% of their work is really about how to help grantees tell their own stories. Because again, you can get our grant, that's great. But if you can get like 5 other grants to do the same work, right, that is even better. And one of the ways you do that is helping to make sure that you're able to collect your own data and tell your own stories about your own impact. And so we really did invest internally on not just people who can help others tell their story, but really thinking about how they move from programs to systems change. Every program is created because something in the system isn't working. How do you know that? Like connect back to that. And how are you informing that system? Because it's still not working because you need your program, right? So that's the kind of work that we're really thinking about, how we structure our grant making and our communications work, because it's not just for us, it's for the field as well and building their capacity to do that work too. But yes and for sure.
Yes, and I think we have time for one more question.
Thank you. I'm Bat Meg. I work for a firm called Nomadic Venture Partners. We're looking at responsible mining technologies. I was wondering, there seems to be this trend that philanthropic groups, impact investors, are often focused on treating the symptom versus the cause of the problem. So in the mining industry, for example, it can only people point at it as potential source of water pollution, but investors would focus on treating the water that's already polluted versus actually fixing upstream the main cause of the challenge. And often there's a reputational risk with engaging with an industry like the mining industry. And knowing that the only rare earth mining project in the US is in California, how can philanthropic groups kind of get past the reputational damage potentially when engaging with these heavy industries?
Well, it takes real institutional fortitude and alignment to take on those kinds of challenges. To your point around analysis on reputational risk, like many different groups of institutions, universities, law firms, foundation philanthropy has been a real target in the current environment. So the issue of reputational risk is alive for us in a different way. I think historically foundations were shy about talking about their institutions, the impact that they were having, advocating around certain issues. That was the work of our grant partners. Let the work speak for itself. well, we're in a different moment. And if we put all the burden, to Toya's point, on our community partners, yes, they need capacity to tell their stories. We can also tell their stories. We can also advocate on issues within the bounds of the various IRS structures we operate under. We still have institutional voice and influence. And I do think that this question of reputational risk is one that's evolving for our institution, the California Wellness Foundation. We've had very explicit conversations at the board level and among staff about how we continue to be bold and assume greater reputational risk around these issues, given what the times call for us to be doing. And so institutionally, when it comes to very specific issues, working upstream versus downstream, classic challenge in philanthropy. Are we doing charity work, or are we really changing systems? That's where this capital stack, this flow of capital, can be really powerful. We can be making grants to deal with issues that are happening in communities today, to support people and advocating and organizing around policies that will address problems or change systems to prevent future problems. We can be using PRIs and endowment investments to be part of the business decisions around the infrastructure and the economic systems in which communities operate. And we can be shareholders and advocating for community benefit agreements as infrastructure projects are being built to really address potential issues and problems before they happen. So I think that there are a variety of ways that we can do that. It's interesting that you framed it around sort of reputational risk being a limitation. I think it frankly goes back to capacity. Most foundations weren't designed to do that kind of work, to take on the role of shareholder advocate, or to sit down with corporate and business interests and say, we think that there's a different way and we want to explain to you what we're hearing from our community partners. We just haven't staffed and organized our institutions to do that kind of work. But it's a terrific opportunity that lies ahead, and it's something that I think each of us is, in our own minds and as wherever we are in a path and kind of rethinking our institutions, we're thinking about. I've staffed, for example, a government relations position on my team. So I've got a full-time director of government relations. This is not someone who's just making grants around policy advocacy. This is someone who's building relationship with decision makers locally and nationally that are approving these projects from a regulatory standpoint that are going into communities and causing problems. So it's an example of building out a different capacity to do the kind of work that you're doing. But that reputational piece is a big one, and I think every institution has to decide, what are you willing to take on right now in order to make change happen in the communities that you care about?
I think for me, you've hit the nail on the head in terms of why I was excited about taking on this role at this particular moment. Because what's happening now is not normal, it's not okay, and we all have a responsibility, particularly in our roles, to be saying that and to be bold and unapologetic in pushing back against the structural isms that have been in place that have created all the challenges that we're trying to fix with this social impact. We've done a conversation with our board, and it was really around risk and what risk tolerance do you have for being in this moment. And very lucky to have a board that said we are going to be bold at this moment. We are going to be a high-risk institution. Come hell or high water, that is what we're going to do. We have the resources to fight back. We have the resources to put a plan in place to deal if we are targeted, if we are... we have to figure out how we protect our grantee partners who are on the front lines of a lot of attacks right now, and how do we resource them. So first time, I think, in the field's history that we're being called, as Richard said, into this new space. And we're one of the few institutions. You know, we don't get voted out. We don't get fired because we didn't do good with our stockholders. We have a lot of liberty, and it's incumbent on us at this moment to use that power that we have.